And you heard from Ken.
I may go a couple over. I know.
All right, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. I'm Matt Rojansky. I'm the director here at the Kennan Institute. I'm very pleased to be able to co-sponsor and present this conference to you. Welcome all of you this morning. There's no question that this is a timely and an important subject. It's always been an important subject, but I think never has it been more timely. For us in particular, in the Russia, Ukraine, former Soviet world, the question of whether democracy, the development of democracy, democracy building and democracy promotion matters, whether it can be successful, what are the tools it takes to make it so. These are all questions I think we'll address today, particularly compelling now, and I think questions on which many other important questions hinge, including those of security and prosperity, not only for the region that we work on at the Kennan Institute, but for the wider world. So I look forward to hearing the insights that our panelists have, that all of you have, and I look forward to spirited discussion. Before I hand the floor over to Ambassador Basora, I want to thank him, Adrian Basora, for really taking point on organizing this entire event for many months now, which has become more and more and more compelling as we've approached the date, as well as Ambassador Ken Yalowitz, who unfortunately, due to Trans-Siberian syndrome, I guess we call it, he just came off a 2.5-week train journey from Beijing to Moscow and picked up the cold that I think, Marianne, you remember, that we all got on the train last year, so he's not able to join us today. I also want to thank my deputy, Will Pomerantz, who will moderate this next panel, Melinda Herring, Maya Adarashvili at FPRI, Madison Brady here, and many others who've made this possible. Ambassador Basora, I think, will introduce the first panel in the conference.
Thanks very much, Matt, and welcome to you all. Ken has the dual hat of having been associated with the Project on Democratic Transitions for the last 9 years since its inception, and being a global fellow here at the Kennan Institute. So working with him, with Will Pomerantz, Matt Rojansky, we put it together. You're very kind to give us all the credit. Would not be at all possible without the extraordinary cooperation we've had with you. So let me thank you and the wonderful team here at the Kennan Institute and the Wilson Center, and for these wonderful facilities that you provided as well. It would be very hard to imagine a more appropriate venue for today's event than the Woodrow Wilson Center. Given that President Wilson started it all in some sense a century ago when he called for the United States to strive to make the world safe for democracy. Furthermore, the timing could not be more opportune. As Matt suggested, it was opportune when we started planning it last spring, even more so today. This is the 25th anniversary, give or take a couple of weeks, of the fall of the Berlin Wall and the entire change of Central Europe, the revolutions in Central Europe. But it's also a season of severe testing or threat to democracy. In many of these same countries where things looked promising 2 decades ago, but also most notably in Ukraine and Hong Kong today. So we are extraordinarily fortunate in having as our lead speakers today 2 of the most revered or respected and revered American figures in the field of democratic transitions. Carl Gershman, for over 30 years president of the National Endowment for Democracy, and Larry Diamond, who's right in the front row, second row, one of our most eminent scholars of democratization, as you know, based at Stanford University and the Hoover Institute. And we are also pleased, very pleased, to have as panelists several outstanding younger scholars and practitioners in our two panels, who have been chosen for their fresh perspectives and their often dissenting views from the conventional wisdom or the traditional policies of the last 30 years. Indeed, one of the goals of this conference, now, could we have, if there are guests in the back row, could we have them move up? We don't need to use all the reserve seats can be used, at least for this session, rather than you're having all to be stuck in the back, if you're able to stay for the full session. So, as I started to say, one of the goals of this conference is to engage the younger generation in deciding what we should or should not do, what we should desist from doing in the area of support for democracy abroad in the decades ahead. And so it's appropriate that the next generation have a major voice in this and formulating the new consensus, hopefully what we will get to as a new consensus. Now, you have bios. I've introduced only two of our speakers by name. You have bio in your conference packages. You have bio information on all of them. Our goal today is to have a really intense, focused discussion where people have a chance to engage, the panelists have a chance to engage with each other. They have dissenting and differing views, and then leaving plenty of time for discussion with you. So that is why we're going to dispense with a lot of formalities. Now, before going on, Thomas Melia, who has agreed, who is our fourth panelist, is stuck in traffic. He's pretty confident of being here in time to engage in the discussion, but I just wanted to explain that will be hopefully part of the agenda. Here are the three central questions that we've asked our speakers and that I ask you, the audience present here and the audience present through webcast, to think about and focus on during this entire day. Three questions, three topics, three issues. First, should support for democratic transitions continue to be a major goal of U.S. foreign policy, particularly in view of the drastically changed circumstances that we face today as compared to the 1990s? What priority should we give to democracy support when it conflicts with other major U.S. national interests? So that's the first cluster of issues, the macro issue. There's room in the front row. You can use a reserve seat for now. Please come up. Second issue. If we should continue policies of active support for democracy abroad, what do we need to do differently to make them work more effectively? Where should we focus our efforts in the coming decades? And what should future democracy assistance programs look like if we indeed continue them? Third question, if we should no longer continue providing active support to democratization abroad, then what should be the alternatives to our present policies? It's not enough to say no, 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 no. We haven't done anything right. Tell us what we should do differently. For example, should America still work to support human rights and basic freedoms abroad at some level? Or should we entirely instead drop this traditional and deeply rooted theme of U.S. foreign policy in favor of a more cold-eyed realpolitik, let's say pure realpolitik? Before going any further, let me underline one key definition in framing today's discussions. It's essential for proper framing of the discussions. What we do not mean by democracy support is the imposition of democracy through external intervention on the model of Afghanistan, Iraq, or other places. Instead, our focus today is on the pros and cons of assisting and nurturing existing attempts at transition and supporting new locally driven attempts at transition when and if they occur, as we did the Velvet Revolution, for example, or so many others. The Round Table Agreements in Poland come to mind powerfully as well. Just a quick word about FPRI, Foreign Policy Research Institute, and our project, its project on democratic transitions. By the way, are the acoustics all right all the way to the back row? Yeah. We think of ourselves, I think we are, an innovative, agile think tank based in Philadelphia, and we especially pride ourselves in trying to maintain an independent, outside the Beltway perspective on global issues. This is why we dare to tackle so many issues that are debated and disagreed on in Washington, and try to take them from a different perspective and feel that we might be able to help break a little new ground. Your conference folders, and if you don't have one there, I think there's still some outside, on the table outside. This is Tom Melia, welcome. You made it through the traffic jam?
I did.
Looks like it. I mean, you made it safely. So you have in these folders, conference folders, the FPRI conference folders, you have a one-page summary of FPRI's activities. And we have here today with us FPRI's president, Alan Luxembourg, right here, who will introduce our luncheon speaker. So you'll have a little better chance, and there are several of us here who are members of who are scholars affiliated with FPRI through the Program on Democratic Transitions. When FPRI invited me almost 10 years ago now to start this program, to set up a program on post-communist, it was on democratic transitions. It was mostly the post-communist transitions that we focused on. And at that time, the leaders of the Orange Revolution had just come to power, as you all recall. And the energy and initially positive outcomes that seemed to be happening in the first months and couple of years of that revolutionary movement, and more importantly, of the many precedents of the 1990s, the successful beginnings of transition of that period, led many, I would say most analysts and policymakers to believe that the prospects for post-authoritarian transitions, not only in the post-communist world, the prospects for democratization in formerly authoritarian countries were very promising, not only in the communist countries, the former communist countries, but also in other areas of the world. Of course, when the Soviet Federation fell apart, people were even more optimistic. Today, by contrast, we see authoritarian regression in many of these same countries, as well as deeply disappointing results over the past 3+ years in the so-called Arab Spring countries. Therefore, the background for our conference today is one of significant, I would call it democratic disillusionment, and much questioning as to the efficacy of U.S. policies in support of democracy abroad. Therefore, my hope today is that we will come away from our proceedings of this conference with a clearer sense of whether this current pessimism or discouragement is warranted, and whether democratic retrenchment, either on the ground in countries overseas or in the U.S. policies in support of democracy abroad, whether that retrenchment is inevitable or whether there are new rationales and new approaches that might permit us to deal more effectively with these resurgent autocratic trends. So those are the three questions, and that is, I want to stress once more our desire for real dialogue, not talking past each other, not making speeches, but looking for alternatives to the extent that you, any of our panelists or any of the audience disagree with current policy. So we've asked our speakers to be very brief in their initial presentations, and they've all said they will try to stay to a very short. But Will Pomerantz, our moderator, who has kindly stepped in for Ken Yalowitz at the last moment because of his flu, has promised to be very strict with his gavel and his clock, his watch. So presentations by our four panelists, then a very brief round where they can respond to each other or add a point or two that may have been stimulated by the others' comments. And then we will open it. Above all, we want to have your comments and questions. So think about your questions, but please keep them brief. Your questions and comments, but please keep them brief when the time comes. I believe we'll have a microphone. Is that correct, Matt? To when the time comes for questions. So what we are seeking here is real engagement and discussions that really stimulate fresh thinking and help to break new ground. So thanks to our very large turnout, as you can see, we've moved the sessions into this large auditorium in which no food is allowed. As a result of that, after the second panel, we have a very short time to move into the Wilson Dining Room in order to permit our luncheon speaker, our keynote speaker, Larry Diamond, proper time to make his presentation. He's agreed to speak as you eat, but when you go into the conference room, very important that you grab your lunch beverage quickly, sit down so that we can get started very promptly. Larry will speak, Dr. Diamond will speak for 30 minutes, and then we'll have 30 minutes of discussion. Immediately after that, we will, right in the same room, go into the final panel that you see on your programs, and the idea of that is to have three or four different members of the organizers of this conference give you their takeaways. They will no doubt be different takeaways, but we view this conference as a starting point for further discussion and further deepening of our understanding of these issues and what the way forward is on these issues. Now, as you probably have noticed from the cameras in the back, the entire C-SPAN is broadcasting all of the proceedings in this auditorium live. Unfortunately, for technical reasons, they cannot switch over to the lunch session. And the entire webcast, the entire conference will be webcast and will be available on the Kennan Institute and the Foreign Policy Research Institute websites. Finally, we encourage you to tweet and ask questions online using the hashtag Democracy Matters, all one word. So, thank you, Will, for stepping in, and I turn it over to you to strictly keep to the agenda. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and welcome to the first panel on revisiting the case for democracy assistance. We have a group of very distinguished speakers. As the ambassador noted, their biographies are in the panel, but this is really a distinguished group that can get to the basic question about how to prioritize democracy promotion and where to allocate different resources as we go forward. The first speaker is Carl Gershman. It is, of course, a great privilege to me to introduce Carl Gershman, who not only has led the National Endowment for Democracy for decades, but also was my boss for a good 7 years. So, Carl, the floor is yours.
Do I push this on or is it on?
It's on.
That's okay. Thanks very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. I've been given 10 minutes to give you a picture of the whole world. I'll do it as a snapshot, and I'll speak in shorthand, so bear with me. I'll raise a lot of issues. We won't be able to probably talk about all of them. It's a very different period today than it was 25 years ago when the communism fell, 30 years ago when the NED got started. When the third wave of democratization crested, communism collapsed, and democracy appeared to be triumphant and inevitable around the entire world. It was a period of a lot of illusions, in my view. Democracy was thought to be inevitable. All countries were thought to be like Poland, which were going to welcome the United States. NED was no longer needed in the views of a lot of people. The government could just step in and do the job because these issues were no longer terribly sensitive. There was something called the transition paradigm, where democracy would just progress in transitional countries according to certain stages. Mark Plattner here and Larry published an article by Tom Carruthers on that in 2002. But it was a period which I think is a little bit, Charles Krauthammer called it a vacation from history. And today we're, I think, a lot wiser. We understand how difficult it is to build democratic societies, especially in countries that lack strong institutions and a middle class, and how strong the resistance to democracy is from the old establishment. This doesn't mean that people don't want democracy. They're fighting for it. China and Russia, from Venezuela to Saudi Arabia, from Pakistan to Azerbaijan. And it doesn't mean that there has been some kind of failure of democracy promotion, which in my view trivializes the problem, which has 5 broad dimensions. The first is that there is a growing effort by the world's autocracies to push back against the advance of democracy, whose purpose is to control civil society and independent media, to contain democracy, to project their own version of reality into the flow of information around the world, and to modify the international norms embodied in the Universal Declaration by elevating the principle of sovereignty above all others. We call that the pushback. The second is the dismal fate of recent efforts to achieve successful democratic transitions, most notably the failure of the Arab Spring uprisings to produce any significant gain for democracy, save for the very fragile transition that's now underway in Tunisia. These uprisings that once generated such hopes for democratic progress have succumbed to authoritarian backlash and the growth of extremist movements. Autocrats have successfully retained power, and where they have faced a concerted challenge, they have not hesitated to use savage violence, as we know in Syria. The third problem involves backsliding in countries that were once considered stable or newly consolidating democracies, but which are now experiencing a surge of populism, extreme nationalism, and threats to independent media and civic institutions. The coup in Thailand, the trend toward illiberal democracy in Hungary, as Prime Minister Viktor Orban has called it, the growing centralization of power in Turkey, the steady retreat in Venezuela and other ALBA countries in Latin America are examples of such backsliding. The weakness of the response of the world's major democracies to the challenges posed by the new authoritarian assertiveness is the fourth problem. Václav Havel, speaking to a conference on Ukraine and the Eastern Partnership that we organized 5 years ago in Lviv, said that, and I quote, that a politics where economic interests are put above basic political values are not only immoral, they are suicidal. Speaking about Ukraine today, the Ukrainian philosopher Miroslav Mironovich has said that if values are sacrificed for security, we will lose both. The suicidal tendency to elevate narrow interests over values is today stronger than ever in both Europe and the United States. Havel was speaking about the weakness of Europe, but the United States is also at fault, and the silence in Latin America toward the erosion of democratic freedoms in many countries has been deafening. We live at a time when the words of the poet William Butler Yeats have special relevance. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are filled with passionate intensity. The fifth problem has been the crisis of democracy in the United States and other leading democracies. It's a crisis that has many dimensions: political polarization and governmental paralysis, our failure to rebuild infrastructure and renew human capital or control entitlement spending, and the financial crisis of 2008 that undermined the influence and standing of the U.S. and other democracies, the impact of which is heightened by the rise of China, which claims to be an alternative model of autocratic capitalism. Now, the situation is by no means all gloomy. I mean, I'll point very quickly to 3 factors which go in the other direction. While there has been a democracy recession, as Larry has called it, there has not been a reverse wave, and the number of electoral democracies, which peaked at 123, is now, according to Freedom House, at 116. That's not a reverse wave. There has also been democratic resilience during the economic crisis of 2008, which surprised a lot of people. There weren't massive collapses of democracy with the economic crisis, and there are democracy movements today with real vigor in Hong Kong, in Ukraine, on the Maidan, and other countries. We must also recognize that some of the fundamental problems that affect the state of democracy have little to do with the success or failure of efforts to aid democracy, however effective or ineffective some of them might have been. First and foremost, we have to commit ourselves to the restoration of American leadership in the world. This is not an expression of American arrogance or a reckless form of overreaching. Rather, it is the recognition of a fundamental geopolitical reality. A world without U.S. primacy, Sam Huntington wrote 2 decades ago, would be a world with more violence and disorder and less democracy and economic growth than a world where the United States continues to have more influence than any other country in shaping global affairs. President Obama himself acknowledged this point in a speech last year to the UN General Assembly when he called U.S. disengagement a danger for the world and a mistake, since it would create a vacuum of leadership that no other nation is ready to fill. The urgent challenge now is for the U.S. to exercise leadership in a convincing manner so that the vacuum is not filled by hostile powers or by chaos and violence. The problem today is not overreaching, as some analysts want to say, or trying to impose democracy on other countries, which is ridiculous to assert today. We need to return to a policy of real engagement. That doesn't mean draining our resources by getting bogged down in distant wars. But it does mean backing up our diplomacy with military power and deterrence, in the absence of which we will have little leverage in negotiations with countries that do not share our commitment to peace and the rule of law. Why should they negotiate seriously if they feel they have the option of achieving their objectives by other means, including the use of force? And why should we hold back from providing Ukraine with the wherewithal it needs to defend itself? And I would call your attention to the article in the Washington Post today by Senators Levin and Inhofe. But the restoration of U.S. leadership will not be possible unless we have the political will and the capacity to bring the spiraling U.S. debt under control. Over the last decade, the gross federal debt nearly tripled to more than $17 trillion and now exceeds the total U.S. gross domestic product. While there are many reasons for the continuing surge in public debt, including the 2008 fiscal crisis, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the principal factor has been the growth of entitlement spending, which has gone from less than 1/3 of the federal budget a half a century ago to more than 2/3 today. In the words of Robert Samuelson, the welfare state is taking over government. Our other priorities are steadily being squeezed out, from investment in infrastructure and human capital to international programs and even defense spending, which is expected to shrink by over 40% over the next decade. But there are things that can be done to address the other problems I mentioned, even though there are no quick or magic bullet solutions. And I'll just give a quick list of some of these things. The effort to push back against the growing autocratic repression must be continued and expanded. A lot has been going on in this area, but more needs to be done. And President Obama's statement on defending civil society made last month in a speech to the Clinton Global Initiative is a step in the right direction if there is real follow-through. And the effort by the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Ed Royce and Elliot Engel, to reform the governance structure of the surrogate radios like RFE-RL and Radio Liberty and Radio Free Asia is an important step to counter the information offensive that is being carried out today by Russia and other autocracies. On the difficulty of achieving successful democratic transitions, I think it's important for civil society and protest activists to learn some lessons from past failures, such as the need to prepare to engage in political action and take responsibility for governance in the event that the protest movements lead to the downfall of autocratic regimes. The protest movements must start thinking strategically and maturing politically. This is happening in Ukraine today with a lot of the protest leaders taking part in the elections that are going to be held next week. There are many things that need to be done to reverse or retard what I call democratic backsliding. Corruption has to be fought with real determination, and in addition to conditionality and assistance programs, something that Larry has talked about and I assume we'll raise today, I think we need to look for new ways to integrate into development strategies efforts to explicitly build the capacity of independent media, which can provide means for economic growth and accountability against corruption. We also have to develop strategies for strengthening democratic culture by supporting indigenous groups committed to building tolerant societies, and also by helping to connect these groups to civic movements like the New Citizens Movement in China or the Yanamar. We've had enough movement in Senegal, and to connect these movements so that they can learn from each other. Obviously, we also have to maintain and build up efforts to support indigenous democratic actors. We have to remember that democracy must come from within. It can't be exported or imposed. This has been the NED model, and it's worked. Steady, cutting-edge support over the long term, tailored to each local situation. The support needs to be comprehensive, involving grant support, training, networking like the World Movement for Democracy, research, and political solidarity. Democracy activists need all of that, and they place special emphasis on the need for political solidarity at a time when autocratic regimes are cracking down so harshly. Finally, we must find a way to rebuild the sense of democratic conviction in the U.S. and Europe. I'm just back from the Czech Republic, and I was struck that our friends there are as concerned about the growth of cynicism and illusions about the dangers they face as we are here. Some of us are here. We'll soon be celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution with a ceremony in the U.S. Capitol unveiling a bust of Václav Havel. We should remember how strongly he felt about the suicidal character of policies that put narrow economic and security interests, so perceived, above freedom and human rights, and his concern about sacrificing values to serve interests would end up undermining both. I think that the best way to rebuild democratic conviction is to connect Americans with people on the front lines of democratic struggles around the world, people who know the dangers and who are prepared to sacrifice to defend their dignity. Drawing spirit from them and maintaining a lifeline of support for their work is important not just for them, but for the security and future of our own democracy. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Carl. Nicholas.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just note, since I am affiliated with the Naval War College, that my comments today are my own opinion and do not reflect any official position of the college or of the U.S. Navy. Those of us that come from the American realist tradition accept the proposition that American national security in the long run is enhanced by the existence of other well-established, stable democracies, because on the most part, they provide higher standards of living, they're more responsive to their citizens, they generally find ways to resolve conflicts without going to war, they are better, they're transparent in how they engage their affairs. Where the rub comes in is two things. The first is that in the short term, democratizing states leads usually to greater insecurity. Those that are familiar with the work of Ian Bremmer and his J-curve, that when you open formally closed authoritarian societies, you generally have drops in economic prosperity, you generally have drops in security. The work that Snyder and Mansfield and others have done, which as you open up closed societies, you run the risk of greater conflict. So this creates security problems for the U.S. because we generally don't like to see disorder, particularly in key parts of the world, as we're seeing now in the Middle East. The second reality that we face is that oftentimes states that democratize and become democracies may become less close partners of the U.S. in security matters. This is particularly the case if the U.S. had supported an authoritarian regime that preceded it, and then a new regime comes in and may seek to distance itself. It may not seek to adopt the full panoply of the U.S. security agenda. So we've had difficulties in our national security establishment in being able to reconcile a commitment to the long term, which is to have the spread of democracy, and then realizing that the short-term impacts of democratization may not be supportive of U.S. security interests. We, of course, have seen this in parts of Latin America, parts of the Middle East. We've seen it in some parts of Asia, and then across the Eurasian space. Then, of course, we come back to the question, well, what about our model in Eastern Europe, Central and East Europe? And I think it is important for us to take a few minutes to look at how and why, under what conditions, American national security interests and a commitment to democratization went hand in hand, because that will help us to tease out some of the factors that we should look for when we're trying to reconcile in other parts of the world some of the distinctions that are there. First thing, of course, is that East European states had clear security threats when they were escaping from the Soviet bloc. They have always been concerned about a resurgent Russia. There were concerns at the time in the early 1990s about Germany, so that these states had real security issues that led them to seek partnership with the United States. This, of course, is where conditionality played a big role, because the United States could make demands and requests of those governments that if they wanted a closer security and political relationship with the United States, if they wanted membership in NATO, if they wanted to be involved in the European Union, there were standards that they would have to meet, so that we could say that we could use that as a very important lever for pursuing and encouraging domestic reform. We also had a certain degree of confidence in the 1990s that we could support a process without having to worry about outcomes. That is, we did not look at many of the Central and East European states and say, well, only a few of the political parties here are pro-Western and pro-American, and then the others may be anti-American or may be opposed to an American agenda. It allowed us to focus on process rather than outcome. We did not have great worries that when the Polish communists came in after Solidarity's term of government, that all of a sudden they were going to rip up everything that had been done, reverse Poland's direction. In fact, the ex-communists in Poland were as supportive of Western integration, of membership in NATO, of membership in the European Union as Solidarity and any of the other political movements in Poland. That allowed our democracy promotion efforts to avoid the appearance of trying to pick winners and losers in the domestic political process. We had a breakdown, of course, of this in Russia in 1996, where we very much had a sense that Boris Yeltsin's victory, was an American imperative. We had to make sure that Gennady Zyuganov did not win that final round of the presidential election. And so that is where we began to see some deviation from that, where it wasn't simply about supporting process, it was about looking at particular outcomes, political outcomes that we wanted. And then as we've gone back and looked at that, was the willingness perhaps to compromise the process or allow the democratic process to be compromised in order to ensure that President Yeltsin would have his second term in office. And finally, one critical part of the Central East European experience, which may not be replicated in other parts of the world, was that the fact that the United States government put its full faith and credit behind the democracy process was very important. Local governments looked at that as part of the validation of the reform process that they were doing. The fact that U.S. officials, that ambassadors, that government functionaries were involved and were supporting this process was seen as a positive for the process. And so therefore, looking at this experience, it can be tempting to say, well, it worked in East Europe, and we had the idea that every country is Poland, and all we have to do is take the Polish model and apply it elsewhere, and we'll have the same results. I think that if we misapply the East European experience, particularly in Eurasia today and in the Middle East, it can lead us to contradictions. It can lead us also to disappointments on our part. Why isn't it working out the way it's supposed to? Why aren't we seeing the emergence of political movements that both support democratic process but also align themselves with the U.S.? We can see different reasons. We see certainly in the Middle East that popular opinion is not particularly supportive of the U.S. national security agenda in the region. So democratization, if we want to have more popular input in how governments are run, the trade-off is to accept that there is going to be governments that if they're dependent on the will of their citizens for their legitimacy, that it will constrain what they can do in terms of cooperating with the United States. Sometimes political movements that are seeking internal democratic reform are not seeking security goals that favor the United States. The Green Movement in Iran was not going to necessarily dismantle Iran's nuclear program. It was not going to be a big part of their issue. So we could support them or not support them, as the case may be. Whether or not we should do that because it supports our values is one thing, but the argument that somehow supporting that movement was going to lead to a geopolitical change in the Middle East, the facts don't seem to point that. We don't have the same sweeteners in terms of European Union and NATO expansion in other parts of the world. We can't offer that kind of conditionality to say that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And this was very much what helped to keep the East Europeans on the track and on the straight and narrow, particularly in the Balkans, that the idea that there was an end goal of joining the European Union and NATO, we don't have those tools in other parts of the world, and it may be more difficult to encourage that. Certainly the rise of China allows for the possibility that we could use that as conditionality, but it could also flip in the other direction, which is that we become so anxious to get allies for China, as we did during the Cold War, that we will overlook a multitude of democratic sins at home if it means that we're putting people into our camp. Finally, just on the last question in the last 30 seconds or so, I think we need to recognize that this tension is here. We can't wish it away between our short-term security interests and our long-term values. Some of the things we may want to discuss in the open discussion is, does this mean we need to separate some aspects of the democracy promotion agenda from day-to-day diplomacy and governance? Do we want to have more civil society participation, less micromanagement from organs of government? The extent to which democracy movements fear U.S. government involvement because that may lead them to being tagged as U.S. agents. And finally, just to end on this point, I think we have to recognize as we move forward, as the democracy promotion movement regains its initiative, as I think it will, we're going to have to live with the fact that the leaders that are produced, as I like to say, will be more Nehrus than Adenauers. They're going to be people who come to power. They will be democratic, but they're not necessarily going to sign up on the U.S. agenda. We've had difficulties in the past with leaders like Nehru, who were democratic but not aligned with us. We prefer that they be Adenauers, and I think we need to find ways to expect that how are we going to interact with the future Nehrus that will be emerging, particularly in the Middle East, in Asia, and then ultimately, we hope, across the Eurasian space.
Thanks very much, Nicholas. Barack.
Thank you. I'm going to be very brief and say that on the democracy assistance hasn't been successful. I think that Tom or others will probably make a strong case for it. I agree with all of it. I think that it has been very successful, and I'll just leave it at that and focus on some of the challenges. Now, I should say also that I'm coming from the World Bank, and these are my own views, not of the bank, but no one at the bank tried to stop me, so there is a democratization movement going on within the bank, too. I think ideas matter, and I think how we frame problems in the world matter. And I think if you just watch 5 or 10 minutes of news, you get the sense of security crises out of control, that we've got border crisis, and we've got terrorism and the long war, and we've got drug wars, and there's just all of these problems. Now we've got the Ebola panic, and we just see that the way that we frame the challenges that we have today, there's a very heavy emphasis on the world is a dangerous place, and we have to do everything we can to keep ourselves safe and keep all of these threats from abroad from wreaking havoc at home. And this is not the first time that we've seen the world this way. This is a recurrent period in history. You can go back, say, after World War I and immigration crises. We got to close the borders, or the communist threats in the 1950s. And so in other periods of our history, we've been able to rebalance the ship and hopefully get a more balanced focus on the problems that we face today. But I think that it's fair to say that we are in a period where U.S. foreign policy is very heavily influenced by security concerns above all else. And I think that matters because it determines policies, it determines the types of programs that we fund and the way that we act to protect our national interests. Now, I'll give you a contrast with the way that we frame problems at the World Bank, which is about the poorest of the poor and how do we ensure inclusive growth. And so every time I have a project proposal, I need to say, well, this is going to benefit the poorest in society. This is about economic inclusion. And you can see how if we had a U.S. foreign policy that was based on trying to spread prosperity abroad and increasing economic inclusion, what might lead us to a different set of policies than we have today, which is where I see everything is a security crisis. We've got agricultural, food security, water security. My favorite new program is fishery security. And AFRICOM in West Africa is right now, the Navy is helping fishermen in West Africa improve the security of their fisheries. Now, of course, fishery security is one way we could talk about the issue, but we could also talk about sustainability or development, and that might lead us to a different set of proposals rather than having the U.S. Navy taking the lead in fisheries development and working with fishermen in West Africa to increase their economic opportunities. And if we frame issues in terms of security challenges, and there's all of these threats to our security, then we have to accept that the military is going to take a lead, and we now have an intelligence community of more than a dozen agencies. I stopped count when I was doing some research on what I was going to say today. And it leads us to, well, sort of blending. We've got the National Security Agency doing spying abroad in here. We're not quite sure everything that's going on. It leads us to accept a level of lack of accountability on military affairs because, well, the world's a dangerous place, and we have to just sort of accept that this is how things are going to be. And I think in the context of lack of faith in our own democratic institutions, this creates a very serious problem. I think I saw last week that the latest Pew poll had trust in government about somewhere around 20%, which means that a large core of Obama's supporters, including me, don't really have a lot of faith in the way things in Washington is broken. It's not just a meme, it's a reality. I think that we have 5 months of Congress not being in power. And you going around saying we've got perpetual war in Syria, we've got this Ebola crisis, but meanwhile our own Congress doesn't really seem to feel any need to act. And so I think that this creates now, just to be clear, I'm not predicting any coups in the United States. I don't think that's going to happen. So don't anyone say, this guy from the World Bank said there's going to be a coup in the United States. No, I'm not predicting anything like that. But I am saying that in excessive reliance on the military, in a situation where we lack confidence in our own elected officials, whom we can control, is perhaps not a great situation. And if we want to rethink about this balance between security and democracy and about how we can engage abroad in a more productive way to hopefully bring about a more peaceful world, we might want to think about actions we can take on our own to perhaps restore a bit of confidence and credibility in the way we think our own government functions. And so Adrian, Ambassador asked me when we were talking about this, well, you're saying that everything is bad and there's nothing good we can do, so give me some actionable ideas. Give me a place to start of things the government could realistically do. And so I've come up with a list of ideas that I think hopefully we can consider. First, I think we need to end giving surplus military equipment to police departments. Giving them tanks that they don't need isn't good for police. It's certainly not good for us. And I think that maybe perhaps many people in abroad saw what was going on in Ferguson, Missouri, and said, well, yeah, what do you expect of the United States? They start wars everyone else. Why wouldn't they put up arms against their own people? I think more transparency in U.S. military programs would be a nice thing. We've got drone wars going in Somalia and Yemen and Pakistan. It would be nice if we had a bit more knowledge about who's being killed and what's the source of this intelligence. How many innocent people are we killing, and not allowing the CIA to classify anyone of military age male as a potential combatant. So more transparency in our drone programs, and certainly more transparency in our military programs all over the world. I work mainly in Africa, and I can't say familiar with U.S. military efforts in the Sahara because they're vast, sprawling, and not very easy to spot unless you're on the ground. So I think it would be nice if we brought a bit more democracy to our security affairs. I think NSA surveillance and the NSA's deliberate attempts to weaken the internet in order to improve its capacity to spy on people, I think that would be something that hopefully we could get a bit of a handle on. And I think it would be nice if we talked a bit about the way that we've extended border insecurity into this 100-mile barrier inside the United States, which includes everyone, Washington, D.C., because we are within 100 miles of a coast, that gives the the Border Patrol a bit of, how would you call it, enhanced capacities for interrogation that I think are a bit worrying. So if none of these are possible, and if you're going to sit here and tell me, well, all of these ideas are far outside the realm of what's achievable given the security crises that we face in the world today, then essentially what you're telling me is that efforts to perhaps redo some of the problems in our own democracy are not possible. And if that's being the case, then we're going to have a very hard time trying to sell the idea of systemocracy credibly abroad. Thank you very much.
And thanks very much. Tom.
Well, thanks, Will, and thanks for the invitation to join this conversation this morning. In the spirit in which Ambassador Becerra launched us a little while ago, I've been thinking about making this a really interactive kind of event. So I've been listening intently to each of the three previous speakers. And it may seem at some level that they presented alternative schools of thought or approach to this question. So I'm not sure I'm allowed to say this, but I agree with all of them. I agree with, in particular, with the way Nick framed the trade-offs that we often face in government between our understandings of potential short-term benefit or short-term need versus long-term. That's the world in which I live every day in the U.S. government as we sit around tables, not usually as pretty as this, but with trying to talk about how we integrate our interest in strengthening democratic governance and respect for human rights into our policies in various parts of the world, policies that are driven increasingly by the security imperatives. You know, we're long past the Cold War that framed the international operating environment for us so neatly, but now there's actually a hot war underway in this global campaign against extremism, violence, and terrorism that is in the ascendancy in some key parts of the world. And so that frames a lot of our discussions about what can we do about democracy in Egypt or Bahrain or in Azerbaijan or Uzbekistan. The principal parts of our relationships with so many countries are driven by a national security imperative that is not theoretical and abstract and long term. It's urgent. It's what gets the President of the United States laying awake staring at the ceiling, I think, in the middle of the night, is who's going to be killed next in the United States or in one of our embassies around the world. And I think that has to be appreciated as we think about how we continue to build out democracy support and democracy assistance. At a moment, and here we are 25 years after the Velvet Revolution, when there is this loss of confidence and a loss of sense of purpose. And I was at the same meeting Carl was at in Prague last week, organized by a lot of friends of democracy in Eastern Europe and the world. And this was the kind of the framing art. You may recall the Czech Velvet Revolution and the Czech transition of 25 years ago was framed by some pretty good art. I loved the various kinds of posters that emerged in that period. But last week at the Forum 2000 conference, there was a lot of the backdrop on the art, and this is the cover of the program for the conference. It says, this is a tweet from Democracy. I miss how loved I was 25 years ago. Tweets Democracy, forlornly. Because nobody thinks democracy is succeeding or doable or worth promoting. And I think this cynicism, this gloominess has infested a lot of conference rooms like this. And I'm troubled by that because I don't think that things are going. I think that we have to appreciate the immensity of the challenge that we have set for ourselves. Those of us who have made the world's troubles, the world's challenges our own here in the United States need to appreciate that it's not going to be quickly or easily done. Carl talked about the illusions of the 1990s when it seemed easy after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of apartheid and transitions in other parts of the world. And we may have gotten too greedy or too somehow thinking this was easy, that the transition paradigms were going to implement themselves. and that all we had to do was go along for the ride and take credit for it sometimes. But I think what we're finding is that some countries have governments and military establishments and tribal leaders and others who are really much more clearly opposed to this democratization than we had encountered in some places in some periods in the past. And so really we are up against much more determined opponents, I think, than we saw in the 90s in so many parts of the world. They're doubling down on their opposition to our support for civil society, for fair elections, for political pluralism, for independent media. And so I think we need to regird ourselves and be thinking more strategically and more carefully. And that means also thinking more long term. I don't think we're going to effect a significant transition in any country for two reasons. One is because it's not up to us. It's been said here that the future of other countries will be determined by the people who live in those countries. And I think we need to acknowledge that in our discussion about democracy assistance, that it's not so much about us, what we do or how well we do it or how much money we have for one account or another. It's really about what are the dynamics and who are the leaders in other societies who want to bring their countries into a more modern political arrangement, a more rights-respecting democratic arrangement. And they'll do that in their own time and in their own way, and we can help them. But we can't make them do it. We can't make bad governments overthrow themselves. We can't make people become Democrats if they are not so inclined. But when we find Democrats, and they do exist in some of the most unlikely places, we can help them. We can help them with information, with assistance, with political protection, with political pressure, with engaging them in the world, integrating them into our societies and our programs in various ways. And I think that we are doing that. And I think that we need to be doing it in a strategic, patient way that acknowledges that it's not just about us, but we need to be prepared for when people have a moment to move their countries in a better direction, that we will be supportive of them in the ways that we have been when there are willing governments in various parts of the world, willing to accept our technical advice or our political assistance. In the ways that we continue to do. USAID is robust in its budgets. The Millennium Challenge Corporation is very effective in a certain range of country possibilities. My own office at the State Department, has had a pretty consistent budget, thanks to the Congress, to support civil society actors in a variety of countries. And of course, the National Endowment for Democracy remains, the premier institution in the world for providing targeted assistance to Democrats, usually in tough places. And so they know that they have help from the outside community, from the international community. So let me mention a couple of things just to wind up this opening scene setter. One is that I think we in the United States need to appreciate the important role that Congress plays while we disparage its occasional polarization and inability to resolve certain major things. The Congress has been a major contributor to American democracy programming in a lot of ways, not least in the creation of my part of the State Department. The Bureau for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor was created 36 years ago at the insistence of Congress over the objections of the State Department and the executive branch. Because it has long been seen in our political culture that we need to have some people minding this part of the store. And so we have played a role, an increasingly, I think, prominent role inside the U.S. government in being part of the conversations about how we integrate security, prosperity, and our support for freedom as well. And so we do that, and we get increasing support from Congress in various ways. And one of the ones that's important for this discussion in an age of heightened security consciousness in our foreign policy is something called the Leahy Law. Senator Pat Leahy, 10 or 12 years ago, first put into congressional appropriations for both the State Department and the Defense Department a provision that says that we cannot provide military equipment or training to security forces units that we have credible evidence are involved in gross human rights violations. This opens up a whole nother dimension of engagement with foreign governments and societies about how security forces can be made more rights-respecting and law-abiding. And it works to some extent. It works in key ways to provide a different kind of pressure on authoritarian governments, particularly those who are allied to us, the kind that was referred to, that are not democratic but are friends of ours, so we're willing to provide them with certain kinds of security assistance. We do that, but now we have a rights dimension to that discussion as well in many places. So I appreciate the role that Congress has played in framing our assistance, our engagement in the world, not least through the funding of the National Endowment for Democracy, but also the large budgets that AID and others get, but also these policy discussions about things like the terms on which we provide security assistance. And I'll just end by echoing what several people have already said, that one of the most important things we can do in the United States to strengthen democratic systems abroad is to be a better democracy. We need to be a better democracy, just like Europe needs to be better democracies, in order for the example to be persuasive and to carry in the wider world. And so I think we need, those of us who care about our international profile need to take an interest in domestic politics in a way that I don't think we always do. I think we always figure somebody else is working on that, and we're just going to solve the rest of the world's problems. But I think that those of us who travel a lot and are called on to explain the U.S. System, I think need to begin to spend more of our time thinking about promoting better government in the United States.
Well, thanks so much, Tom. Before we open the floor to questions, we're going to give each speaker a chance to give a brief response to what they've heard, 2 to 3 minutes. We'll start with Carl.
Well, thanks. Maybe the first point to make is one that Nicholas concluded on, which was that, the Nehru problem, as it were. I mean, I prefer Nehru to Mao. And I prefer a democratic India to totalitarian China. We don't expect every country, when they become democratic, somehow to do our business, to do our bidding. But democracies tend to be friendlier than dictatorships, which, often rely upon needing enemies, which whip up extreme nationalism to deal with their legitimacy problems. I prefer South Korea to North Korea. And South Korea is not perfect, and a lot of people in South Korea that have had problems with the current government. But I assure you it's better than North Korea, and not just that it doesn't have a gulag and murder its own people, but it's friendlier to us than North Korea. And those are the choices we face in the world. And it's not irrelevant, that democracies are not perfect and 100% allies. Second point, change sometimes is difficult. First of all, we don't bring about all that change. Mubarak was not going to be permanently there. The question is how to manage change. The problem with the Mansfield argument that you referred to is that he considered Milosevic to have been a product of democratic change, that this was a transitional government. Milosevic was not a Democrat, and it's a false argument. There is instability in the world. The question I think we have to face is, as we think about this work, what is the division of labor between a non-governmental entity like the NED and the U.S. government? And what do we want from the U.S. government? One thing we do want, and I've said this, is that the people that we support could use the help, the diplomatic and political support of the United States and of the West. A lot of that is being done to a certain degree. They need it more. You cannot view democracy assistance in a vacuum. You need to back it up with the political support that the activists need in order to survive, in order to function. We need a strong voice on these issues. We should not call dictatorships democratic or in the process of a democratic transition, as we've basically referred to Egypt recently. We may need to work with Egypt as a country that shares certain interests with us in the Middle East at a time when you have ISIS. But we don't need to call them democratic. And we need to speak about human rights, and it doesn't necessarily conflict with our interests in these countries. Finally, I think we underestimate the extent to which democracy and progress for democracy depends upon an orderly international environment. You're much more likely to get democratic progress where there is a certain modicum of world order than you are where there is chaos. And one of the things I was arguing for is that I don't think it helps to remove the pole that holds up the tent of world order. And I consider that pole, and we can argue about this, to be U.S. leadership, U.S. influence, because nothing is going to take its place. It's not all the answers that we have, but a stable world will depend upon that, and I think democracy needs that in order to progress. Two last quick points. We as a country, in thinking about our foreign policy, have to find the balance between what my board member Steve Sestanovich calls maximalism and minimalism. We tend to have these swings, sometimes very, very sharply. There is the possibility of a solvent, stable middle ground. We have to fight for that, which can take account of the need for power, the need for deterrence, and also the need to support people who are fighting and struggling for democracy. And second, and related to that, something we're thinking about, I think we have to really start thinking very clearly about the relationship to security issues to democracy issues. These are complex questions, and I think it's important to bring people together to start thinking through these complex questions, because it's not necessarily, friendly tyrants are not necessarily the source of stability and friendship in the world. And we have to somehow think about how to balance the tensions that exist. There'll always be tensions, but we can find a better way to balance them than we have in the past.
Thanks. Certainly, North Korea is a worse case than South Korea, and I think there's no disagreement there. For the U.S., of course, the India example is that our preference for Pakistan, when it did not have a democratic government because of the belief that it was closer to U.S. security interests, I think is more akin to what I was trying to get at. We can always have a clear-cut case of where democracies are always preferable, even when they have issues. And then we do have to get, I think, though, and Tom, I think that this point you were bringing up is very critical of how we find these balances of what we're willing to give up in terms of our security agenda. And with Egypt, I think it is a great case. We could have advanced a democratic agenda or been more willing to do so if there were certain elements of our security agenda we were willing to give up. What I'm trying to argue is we can't do both. We will have to have these debates. We have to find where the balance is going to be between we would prefer to see a democratic government and therefore willing to see on a set of issues a recession, and then conversely, I think, when we have security issues where we might feel that transitions might be problematic in the short run. And again, having a calculus, I think, is better than simply flailing out and simply saying, well, these issues don't exist or we can do it all. And I think that one of the issues I think we've had in recent years, the criticisms that are out there, is that we don't seem to be able to strike this balance. We also then have to strike a balance with our diplomacy. You can't go to a government that is authoritarian, that you are now asking for a whole list of security cooperations, and then say, by the way, we're also working to change your form of government, if that change of government is being perceived as change of elite, change of regime. And again, it's not that we can't do both or that we should give up one or the other. It's just being able to have these conversations about what we're willing to accept, what half-a-loaf solutions we're willing to have. I was glad that you mentioned the Leahy Amendment, because if I had, we always have more time, we can always bring up more things, and I think that's a great example of where we can use our conditionality, because a state is free to reject our security assistance if they don't want to abide by those terms, and some countries don't. But certainly what I see in the context of IMET, of the international military education, is that it has an impact, because when you say that you're going to have, in order to get security assistance from the U.S., you have to meet these standards. And when our diplomats can go to other countries and say, you will have to pass certain smell tests with the U.S. Congress in order to get certain things, that can be effective. So I think that is one of the ways that we can find, we can search for the conditionality that we need if we want to pursue these things without having it, again, become this either or. We can either pursue security or either pursue democracy, but not both. So I think that the Leahy Amendment and other things like that are important for us and we continue our discussions today. I think we should look at those as being tools that can serve both sets of interests.
I want to pick up on the point of instability in the world. I think it's working in Africa and spending a fair amount of time there. I see this all over the place, and I think that what we're seeing, if you take Somalia as an example, this is a problem that we've been faced with over 2 decades now. 1994 is when the U.S. went in the first time there, and it's still broken, and it's still, and the security threats there are real, and we have to think about what is a way to work more constructively in these societies. I think Israel has been trying to bomb Hamas out of existence for a long time now. And the more bombs they drop, the more problems they wind up creating for themselves. And I'm not saying that we need to go and bring terrorist groups into governments. I'm certainly not saying that at all. But if you think about Libya or large parts of the Sahel or large parts of the Middle East, these are countries that are going through profound and difficult challenges, and it's going to take much more than a military solution. And I hope that Tom is leading a lot of these efforts to bring the State Department into these and to bring USAID more into these challenges, because they require political settlements. Now, on the positive side, and I said that I think U.S. democracy assistance has been very effective over taking a broad view, is that most of Africa, where I work, there are elections, and there are vibrant elections, and getting into power really means something. And certainly there are problems in almost all of these countries with corruption and vote rigging and poor rule of law. But I also see that losers are upset too, and they take steps to try and make these countries more effective. And so I see, in that sense, I see a lot of positive change, and I see a lot of countries that are the competitive role of politics makes people at times want to improve the rules of the game so they can increase their chances of winning, or more transparency for the government, or stronger media to be critical. And so in that sense, I think that we have that 2 or 3 or decades ago, no one would have predicted that Ghana would be such a great democracy, or Senegal, or even all the problems in Kenya, or Zambia, and then it can go on. And so I think we shouldn't have undue pessimism, because I think that given where a lot of these countries started 30 or 40 years ago, no one would have predicted that they have challenging problems. And I think that we should be proud of the work that we've done there and learn from those lessons and apply them to challenges we face today.
Thanks. And Tom?
The United States remains the most important country in the world, and is also the one that's providing the most important leadership on democracy and human rights, bar none. Pick the next 10 most active democracy promoters in the democratic world, and they don't add up to half of what the United States is doing. And that's not just in the funding, that's in the diplomatic and political leadership that the United States continues to provide. We're trying to overcome a period in which we seem to do that in an arrogant and clumsy way. And so it may be sometimes too subtle for some. We're not as over the top in our rhetoric as we might be, or that might be more pleasing to some. But the United States is at the center of every important conversation on how to defend democratic governance and institutions, and in developing strategies on trying to widen those circles. It's not always public, but every other government will tell you that when they want to have a discussion about what to do about X country, it starts here. So I'm confident and comfortable that we're managing an effort. The effort, as I said earlier, has some very strong opposition to it in some key governments, in some key non-governmental actors in the world. And we're incurring some costs in other parts of our relationships. I mean, our advocacy for activists in places like Azerbaijan and Russia comes at some cost to our bilateral relationships in those places. We are active in defending those who speak up for the kind of values that we share. We do that publicly and privately. We are engaged with non-democratic but allied or partner countries in a wide range of ways. And it does come at some cost in other parts of our relationships on security and other matters. So that's the enduring trade-off. That's the balance we have to sometimes find, is where, how much of a cost in a different part of our relationship can we incur in defense of our values, And that's what we wrestle with every day. And depending on the circumstance, depending on the threat, depending on various things, we might be more forward-leaning in some dimension and less so in another dimension. But that is what happens on a daily basis inside the U.S. government. Barack mentioned earlier that at the World Bank there's a movement for democracy, among people that work there, thinking that it matters more and more to their work. And that's also true in the United States. During this last 25 years in the United States government, these last 25 years, it has become part and parcel of every diplomat's DNA to appreciate that the democratic character of governments that we partner with affects their international posture and policies as well. And our military establishment, our intelligence agencies, I think increasingly understand that and increasingly weave that into their engagements with their partners as well. So it's not a universally held view yet, but it's an emerging and growing view. And so I think that we will continue in this direction for at least another 25 years, and hopefully we'll have a few more successes to talk about when we meet 25 years from now.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. I am going to open the floor to questions. I do ask that you keep your questions to actual questions. We've had some very long and very detailed presentations here. I know this is an issue that a lot of people have opinions on, but I want to restrict the discussion to questions and answers. So please focus on questions and not comments. So we'll take this person right here. And we'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you. My name is Melia Sadeghi from the E-Collaborative for Civic Education. We run projects to help civil societies through civic education, and one of those is Tavana, which is an e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. My question is, when does U.S. policy harm democratic development? It seems like we're focused on ways that we help it or don't help it, but not focused on ways that we can and do sometimes harm it. One case in point for me, and I was surprised that people didn't really mention Syria. In Syria, we had a case, and it wasn't just for a few days, it was for a considerable amount of time when there was a peaceful, liberal, democratic opposition to Assad. And President Obama, the approach was support that wasn't really support, red lines then that weren't really red lines, and now we have a fight that is not really a fight. And what the result has been an emboldened Iran, an emboldened Russia, and these things aren't good for democratic development. And about
But question, please.
My
so
question
the
is
question
when-
is, when does U.S. policy harm democracy? So we'll throw that.
with a focus on Syria,
The
please.
focus on Syria. So someone who wants to respond to that question.
All I can say is that you're basically just putting a little bit of flesh on the bones of the argument that I was making.
Can you spell that out, Carl? I don't understand.
You don't understand what I just said? I don't think it was wise not to support the secular struggle in Syria. I don't think that was wise. And I think that was the view that was taken by Panetta, by Petraeus, by Clinton. I think it was a mistake. And I don't think it was helpful. And I think it helped produce the problems that we have today. There were a lot of other things that helped produce the problems that we have today. I would like to see us do much, much more in Ukraine. And when we don't, we open the way up. We give a green light to some very bad actors who feel that they can take advantage and have, I think that we really need to be looking at not just, providing net democracy assistance in Ukraine. They need to be able to deter a foreign aggression. And we have to be able to help them. And if we don't, we're not helping democracy.
Okay. In the back here. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub, University of Wisconsin. I'd like to ask, what's the best way to respond to efforts by authoritarian governments, such as in Russia and elsewhere, that pass legislation that tries to isolate local civic society groups to say, if you so much as accept $1 from any outside source. You have to register as an agent. Obviously, they're painting them as somehow unpatriotic in other ways. Do we attempt to fly under the radar, or should we take a more active response to these efforts?
So, I addressed that in my remarks. I said that President Obama made a very good statement last month at the Clinton Global Initiative, where he laid all this out. We really need follow-up on that. A lot of this has to do with political support, political backup to the activists on the ground. Let me just say that regarding Russia, there are some people who jump to the conclusion that when Putin speaks, everything, that's the way it goes. The groups in Russia, have refused to abide by that law to register as foreign agents. They're fighting back. And for what it's worth, our grants program in Russia has been growing over the last number of years. It's at a peak right now. So they're not running away. The people who are running away, I regret, are a lot of the Western donors who have just withdrawn from the situation, which is a mistake. You need to re-engage with both concrete support to the activists on the ground wherever possible and political support to push back against this kind of aggressive behavior. Putin says, what he's doing is just the same thing that we do. It's not. It's a violation of international law. It's consistent with international law for non-governmental organizations in a transparent way to seek support, financial support for their work. There's nothing inconsistent with that. I think we need to push back very, very hard.
Any other comments? Yeah.
As the U.S. has done. The Foreign Agents Law that was enacted a couple years ago after Putin's return is an echo of an earlier effort from 6 or 8 years ago to overregulate NGOs and restrict their access to the international community. We're not as persuasive with the government of Russia as we might be with some others, and so they haven't taken our advice on how to organize their NGO laws and their approach to international funding for nonprofit activity. But as President Obama said last month on the margins of the UN General Assembly in the meeting that Carl has referred to, it is our policy to continue to support civil society around the world, including especially in places where it's under pressure from their own governments. So we're continuing to do that. And we're working with other governments and other international organizations to do that. And so there's a wide range of ways in which those in Russia and other countries that want to access not just funding but want to be part of the international community can do so. And so we're working to make more and more opportunities available to them, including from our embassy. There's an embassy program to provide grants to Russian groups that want to work with Americans and vice versa. So as Carl said, the endowment continues to work there. The U.S. government continues to support civil society in Russia. The only thing that's changed is that the Russians obliged us to close the U.S. aid mission 2 years ago. So there is no U.S. aid mission there. But that doesn't mean that our support to civil society in Russia has diminished in any notable way, although as Miriam's comment suggests, there are Russian organizations who've decided to manage their own environment in such a way that they don't want to receive grants from outside or from the U.S. or other governments. So they're making their own choices. But when they want our support, they get our support.
Any other comments, Nick? Or no? Okay.
More people in here.
Okay. Let's take right down here. We'll get a microphone to you.
Thank you. Leandra Bernstein, RIA Novosti. It's difficult not to hear the discussion of democracy, U.S. support for democracy, and hear it synonymous with countries who share U.S. interests, economic interests, security interests. I know you've raised some specific countries where that's not the case, but overall, democracy seems synonymous with U.S. interests. Now, what do you say to countries who are doing well, like China, like Russia, comparable to its past, who view these democracy movements as inherently subversive, as attempting to subvert their specific national interests to one of simply U.S. interests, U.S. global hegemony?
Anyone?
I mean, I'm happy to say something, but let them say
Exactly.
something.
You want to?
I have a lot to say.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Let me just respond briefly. I think it was already put forward here by this panel that democratic movements and democratic countries don't always agree with U.S. policy. So that's a discussion we can have with democratic governments and democratic societies. We do that all the time. We don't automatically agree with France or Canada or Australia on every question that comes down the pike. So we're perfectly comfortable with democratic processes leading to governments that may disagree with us on one policy question or another. It's not about U.S. hegemony in the world, as you put it. It's really about whether people can decide for themselves who governs and how they govern. And in China, there's not a real discussion about public policy in China. There's no critical views of the economic system. There's no critical views about the treatment of religious minorities or of what's going on in Hong Kong, for that matter. China is an example of a certain kind of economic system, but it's based in large part on political repression. And so that's we don't know. We don't know if the Chinese people support that system because they're not allowed to be asked or to answer that question. So,
Well, they have. I mean, look, you have Charter 08. You have signed by. It's very hard for people to sign a charter, but over 11,000 people immediately signed that charter, and the main author of it, Liu Xiaobo, is now in prison. What do I say to Xi? I mean, I don't talk to him. It's the U.S. responsibility to talk with him or to talk to Putin. It's not my job. There are people in those countries that you need to recognize. They are people who are aspiring toward a different kind of a life that will give them, a little bit more recognition, dignity, and so forth. The only question is whether we're going to recognize those people. It doesn't mean that our government does not have an obligation to maintain, stable relations with some of these countries. But, what's going to happen in China is not going to be because of what Obama says to Xi. You have really revolutionary forces at work there. We'll see how successful China is, given the fact that middle class is growing. You have the geometric growth of the internet communications. It has some very, very severe problems, and I think we've published a lot of articles about this in the Journal of Democracy, and I think the feeling is that, and Larry is just back, and he may talk about it today. I think you should question Larry on this, but he's not gloomy when it comes to the prospects for China. And when you say Russia, which is doing so well, yeah, compared to Stalin's Russia, it's doing great. And I really think, frankly, I think it's an enormous progress. But it's actually, in some ways, Putin, he took over 15 years ago. It was the FSB taking over. They felt, they were taking over from people they considered to be traitors, feckless Democrats, people who were giving up Russian interests, and they were going to assert Russian interests. He's a problem.
It's not the case that the democracy movements have tried to overthrow his government, though?
The democracy. Look, a movement emerged in December 2011, the Snow Revolution, they called it, where they wanted something different. They wanted real elections. They wanted protection for human rights. You call it overthrow. I call it, rights and democracy. They wanted a more open political system. They were objecting to the fact that Putin just said, I'm coming back. Medvedev, you move aside. And it was almost like it was an arranged, something arranged without having any consultation with the people. And I think that's one of the things that stimulated the protest. Then he comes in and he's cracked down on that. We'll see where it goes. Khodorkovsky was here, gave a very important speech at Freedom House a couple of weeks ago and talked about a strategy for the future. There are alternative voices there. Right now, they're not a majority, and I don't suggest that they are. But there are alternative voices, and we'll see where Russia goes. The economic crisis is going to deepen. There's no question about that, especially now with the oil prices going down. It's going to sharpen the contradictions. And a lot of people feel, that the Putin regime could collapse. The question really is it possible? Is it possible for it to be replaced by something better, or will it be replaced by something worse? We don't know. But if that does happen, I think we should hope that the people who offer a better alternative are in a position to exercise some influence in that transitional situation.
Right here. And could you please identify yourself as well?
Lee Voth-Gettert, thank you for the panel and your time.
Could you identify yourself, please?
Lee Voth-Gettert with development agencies within the government. I had a question for Dr. Hoffman and Mr. Thomas as well. Development versus democracy, especially in Africa and around the globe. Is there a time for development? Is there a time for democracy? Because we've kind of been talking about the dynamic system that we're in. How do we decide when we need to focus on development versus democracy, or do we implement them at the same time, or in that kind of dynamic timeline of countries within, especially Africa, but around the world as well?
Barack.
I think that many people in here have written about this. I don't think that there's any inherent contradiction. And certainly the argument that we shouldn't push for democracy because it's going to somehow derail development, I don't see that that's, I can see certain countries, maybe you want to say Rwanda or Ethiopia, that are developing and not democratic. But at the same time, I think that you're not going to, there's no reason not to support it there, and there's no reason not to give assistance to groups there. And then I see in other countries where development along a democratic trajectory can be complicated at times. It can be prone to all sorts of perhaps instability or corruption. But at the same time, I think that if you look at growth rates in sub-Saharan Africa over the past decade, well, Africa is the fastest growing region in the world. So some countries that have very high levels of instability, Kenya is a chaotic democracy, for example, is growing quite rapidly, and I spend a lot of time there, and they have an incredibly dynamic private sector that doesn't feel threatened or too concerned about the instability there that comes around election times. And even in Nigeria, you talk to Nigerian business people, and they have strategies. They leave the country for a few weeks, maybe they put their money in overseas bank accounts, but it's still a thriving country. So I think the notion that there's some sort of a trade-off there is one that's been forwarded in the past and tested, and I think rejected in most cases.
Tom, you wanted to? No.
Just to point out that World Bank experts agree there's no developmental advantage to dictatorship.
And Carl, you had a question?
Yeah, I just want to use that as an opportunity to elaborate on a point I made briefly in my remarks. There's obviously an interrelationship between development and economic growth and democracy. We're looking through our Center for International Media Assistance at an initiative that will try to embed in development strategies support for free media. I think it would be critical for development if there could be more independent free media in countries that are seeking to make economic progress. Because without free media and without the exchange of information, without the accountability on corrupt governments that free information and free media can bring, you're not going to get real development.
So just to state the obvious, that has been a major part of U.S. development strategy, is to support independent media through AID programs, and my own office supports a variety of independent media operations and training programs. So you're acting as if it hasn't been done.
Embedding it in development strategies so that development institutions and agencies more explicitly support free media, not DRL or the State Department.
USAID does. It's part of AID's development strategy.
It's not a priority. I'm talking also about Europe. I'm talking about the global development agencies. So it's not there, Tom.
Okay. We're going to bring Adrian here into the conversation.
Adrian Bassaro, Foreign Policy Research Institute. Some of you have alluded to the decreased U.S. leverage in the world and the adversities, and we've all talked about it this morning. My question is, I know that you, Carl, and Tom, and Barack, of course, you at the World Bank, are trying to get others to do more of the job. You said that we overwhelmingly are the main supporter of democracy around the world. The National Endowment, the European Endowment for Democracy has been created. There have been others. I know you've been taking some initiative on that. My general question is, what are the prospects for, and what is the methods of getting to a point where other democracies help a lot more? It's not always the case that the U.S. is the best point man. Sometimes international entities, sometimes other countries will be much more credible. Thank you.
It's a good question. Let me just say that just next month I'm off to Korea where we're going to have a meeting on precisely that subject. There's now the creation of an Asia Democracy Network, bringing together activists from all over Asia. The Korean government is looking outward more as we look more, as we've been sort of withdrawing a little bit. They're beginning to become more active, and we're trying to encourage that. They may take an interest in Central Asia. But this Asia Democracy Network is based in Korea. The Secretariat is provided by 4 Korean NGOs, and they want to see the creation of a Korean NED that will, provide the institutional resources that they need really to exercise more of a role in Asia. So there are going to be people there from the European Endowment for Democracy. There are going to be people there from the UN Democracy Fund and from some of the NED family institutions, NDI and the Center for International Private Enterprise, to talk about different models and to encourage Korea to take this step. And we've done that with a lot of other countries.
Okay, I see several hands up, so I'm going to take, as best I can, I'm going to take 3 questions, and then we might be running out of time. So 1, 2, and 3.
Alan Luxembourg
George,
from
yes.
the Foreign Policy Research Institute. A number of the commentators have talked about the trade-off between security and democracy. I'd like to ask about the trade-off between democracy and liberalism. In other words, if we have democratic elections tomorrow throughout the Middle East and Muslim Brotherhood governments come to power, is that good for democracy, and is it good for the United States?
Okay, and the second question was right here. Bring a microphone right here to this gentleman, please. Right here.
Can you please?
Raise your hand again. It was this gentleman right here. So we just bring the microphone to him. Thank you. Could you just stand and identify yourself as well?
Hi, Dominic Blown, American University. I guess I would play off the trade-offs. And Carl, you mentioned this in your point 4 about the placing of their values. Is economics, there's a lot of emphasis on global trade, deregulation, economic growth, these things, which as some economists have said contributes to wealth inequality. To what extent does that conflict with democracy? The levels of wealth and tying into global trade.
Okay, and the last question right here. This gentleman right here, if you could stand up and identify yourself.
Good morning. My name is Calva Willis. I'm a student with the Democracy and Governance program at Georgetown University. My question is for Mr. Melia, but also for the rest of you, based on a comment that several of you made about the crisis of democracy at home and how we can better promote that as agents of foreign policy, more or less. Especially in the State Department when we have to maintain an image of solidarity and support for U.S. policies and how we run government at home, how we can come home from our work abroad and make ourselves a better democracy and in turn that around to work to our advantage abroad. Thank you.
Okay, let's take those 3 questions and...
You choose the order.
We'll start with the first question, the question about democracy versus liberalism in the world today.
Of course. I mean, look, majoritarian democracy is not liberal democracy. Just an election is not democracy. When we think of democracy, we think about the balance of not only separation of powers, the Bill of Rights, individual rights, and so forth. And that's going to be a long and difficult struggle, And I think the Middle East is where it's, maybe the weakness of liberal values in democratic aspirations is probably most dramatic, but it exists in other regions of the world. And when we talk about democracy, when Freedom House rates countries according to its survey, it involves not just political rights but also civil rights, and that's very, very central. So we don't accept as something which is democratic if a majority uses it to impose its power and on the minority, and that's what I was talking about when I was speaking in my remarks about the problem of democratic backsliding.
Mm-hmm. And economics and trade?
That's you, Brock.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think this is critical in much of the part of the world where I live, and I see this from South Africa to Egypt. It was problems of lack of. Well, I mean, I think the bank. I think we have it right. I think it's about shared economic growth and in particular, jobs. And when the contradictions between the elite and the regular people got so severe in Egypt and Tunisia, perhaps not so much in other countries, but that was ultimately, it was about that. So I think this is critical. I know that in much of sub-Saharan Africa, you've got there's a very large youth bulge, and most people are under the age of 30, and the growth there isn't producing jobs, and this is a harbinger of a very big crisis. In fact, it's been the biggest crisis in South Africa and it's a very unstable situation. So I think that, and also in the Middle East, and I think that also in Syria, that yes, large groups of reasonably well-educated but unemployed men of working age is a sure sign of instability, no question about it.
You know, Sidney Hook, the late philosopher, once wrote an essay, gave it actually as a talk, called The Social Democratic Prospect, in which he said, we put freedom first, but if you have levels of inequality that are so great, it ultimately will undermine the kind of political freedoms that we cherish. So inequality is a very, very fundamental problem that has to be addressed. The only thing I would say that I believe that a free and open society with the rule of law will do better in terms of managing these issues of inequality. You can say, yes, China has grown, it's developed a middle class, but I think that's only laying the conditions for a political transition if they want to continue along this road, because you're going to need the rule of law to do that. Well, last point. In democracy, people can organize if they have the rights to organize and defend their interests, and that also can lead to greater protection for them and greater respect for their economic rights.
Well, we've almost. Do you have a last comment, Tom? Or?
Are you going to go back around at the end?
I think we're about run out of time. So I do want to get Nicholas back into the conversation, actually, because there haven't been any questions directly to Nicholas, but I do want to kind of get his take, as we've talked about the role of democracy in development and so forth in terms of how we create long-term interests. Where does these issues play in terms of these short-term goals? Tom also talked about balancing these very important considerations. So from your perspective, as you take a more realpolitik view of the world, where do you place issues like democracy and development, and to what extent, by focusing on realpolitik issues, do you face the backlash when the ultimate revolt comes, and we are unprepared to deal with that reaction?
Well, I think what's been interesting about many of the questions, it comes back to a point that the ambassador raised in his opening remarks, which is democracy promotion, what point of the foreign policy pyramid should it be? Is it the apex? Is it one of many? Of several issues, and going, whether it's Syria or Ukraine or the Middle East or anywhere else, we do struggle with where are we going to put this? And I think that coming back to this question of realpolitik, one of the things I think we found, and this goes back to the Korea example and other things, that if a country is tied to us because it has an existential security threat, when it changes governments, when it becomes democratic, it doesn't usually abandon the relationship with the United States. So the South Korean activists who were jailed in the 1980s, who then come to power later on, don't repudiate the U.S. alliance, because as long as North Korea and the People's Republic of China exist, there's a reason for South Korea to remain tied, even regardless of the values connection, but there's simply a hard security connection as well. So I think understanding those dynamics is important, understanding the dynamics of interest when you have a growing middle class that has economic ties to the United States or has ties to the U.S. business economy and to what we do here. Those can help to smooth over when there's been a transition from an authoritarian to a democratic regime without jeopardizing the security interests. And then in contrast, in the absence of those interests, in the absence of those security and business connections, you can then have this sudden reversal, as you've pointed out, that when a government that is seen as authoritarian, or if the U.S. has been seen as backing an authoritarian government, then when you have the transition occur, you don't have those constituencies in place to continue maintaining a good relationship with the United States. We also come back, I think we all talked about our internal democracy, and I think ultimately, and perhaps in future sessions we'll get at this further, we also have a question of we are a democracy ourselves, and our foreign policy reflects what the American people want, and the American people generally want a low-cost intervention policy around the world. We're happy to support democratic movements. We're happy to support and give aid up to a certain point. And then the question is when those costs are hit, political leadership either has to make the case to the American people why this matters and why you have to sacrifice, or political leadership backs away and says, okay, the costs are too high now, so we're not going to do it. Syria, I think, was a great question of that, we could have supported a movement there, but there were costs involved, and I don't know that people were willing to pay those costs, or at least to justify that to a domestic audience. And given that we are a democracy, our foreign policy can't, ultimately comes back to that question as well. The American people get the final vote, and they'll determine what mix of values, what mix of realpolitik and values and promotion of democracy. And I think Americans would like to do both. But then again, when they come into conflict, I think that's where we end up with these debates.
Let's pose the
30
choices
seconds left
clearly.
for
Boots on the ground or doing nothing. There is something in between.
Oh, of course there is something in between. I'm not saying that it's either or. I'm just saying that Americans.
Well, pose the choices clearly to the American people before they. before you
That's the
decide
job.
what they
It's
think.
the job of political leadership to do that.
I think we can thank all our speakers for a very interesting panel, and thank you all for coming. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and we'll resume here at 11 o'clock. Punctually, please, 10 minutes.